Thanks again for joining me in International Politics of Climate Change. This is week 10 and we're exploring global climate justice. Now you've heard me say this previously, but let me say it again. I strongly argue that our collective response to climate change is a project of global justice. Let's start with an obvious key point. If justice is an objective, that necessarily means that injustices have occurred and injustices continue to occur. So this is where global climate politics starts getting personal, where the global and the local converge, because it's a set of discourses coming from those on the receiving end of dominant power structures. Also, at the core of this topic is the idea that the responsibility for past emissions is not evenly shared, and the impacts are not and will not be evenly distributed. There's a disconnect between those who created the problem and the people, communities and countries who will suffer the most, but whose contribution to carbon pollution is minimal. So if we combine these two elements, the core point of climate justice is that systemic discriminations of pre-existing injustices need to be addressed for effective climate mitigation and adaptation. This topic prompts us to face the collective shadow of our society and our world, and I'm not going to pretend that this will be easy work. You might find some of this content confronting, uncomfortable or distressing. I want to acknowledge those of you who've experienced direct trauma from the injustices that are addressed in the material this week and next. Those of you who haven't had those experiences might struggle in grappling with your place in larger systems of systemic power. The process of problematizing some of the core assumptions of international politics and your own assumptions about how international politics works can trigger some resistance. I acknowledge all of these complex feelings that might arise. This is an inevitable part of trying to navigate the difficult terrain of climate justice in the real world. But please don't run from any discomfort that arises. Sit with it and reflect deeply about why that discomfort might be coming up for you. We do this with dignity and respect for our peers and with dignity and respect for those around us, with an understanding of our complex interconnection. So please do feel free to talk it through with me if you need to. I'm definitely here. So in this video, I'm going to look at the historic responsibility for emissions and the doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities. I'm going to look at colonialism and ecological debt. I'm going to look at climate justice and environmental racism, as well as the gendered dimensions of climate justice and representation for future generations and non-human life. Let's start by recalling the clear correlation between economic activity, fossil fuel energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions, which we did explore in weeks 4 and 5. So this relationship gives us a clue as to the historic responsibility for greenhouse gas pollution. In the UNFCCC, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities has been employed as the tool for incorporating the different needs and goals and capabilities of countries across the world within one treaty regime on the basis of the historic relationship between industrialisation, fossil fuel energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Because of the historic emissions burden of the global north, global south countries have argued that developed nations should take the lead in emissions reductions and bear a majority of the costs in the collective global effort to reduce emissions. Because global north countries have had a head start in industrial development, they have the financial capacity as well as the greater technical expertise to help global south countries to reduce their emissions burden. The core contention that underpins the doctrine of common differentiated responsibilities in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is that the countries of the global north have been pursuing industrial development for over 200 years, meaning that the overwhelming majority of greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere over that period were put there by developed states. And within those developed states, a small minority of the most wealthy citizens are responsible for a lion's share of those emissions. That's just the reality of the relationship between production, consumption, energy use, and emissions. Also, Global South countries want lifestyles and living standards that are enjoyed by people in the Global North. They argue that because the Global North had such a long head start in industrialisation, the countries of the South should be given time to develop their economies and therefore increase their carbon emissions before they be bound by the same emissions reduction obligations as Global North states. We see this encoded into the language of taking into account domestic circumstances and capabilities, quote unquote, in the formulation of nationally determined contributions and in the formulation of national adaptation plans in the Paris Agreement, which is a further application of common but differentiated responsibilities. Rising tides do not lift all boats. The Global South's underdevelopment is a key factor which undermines the ability of these countries to adapt to climate change impacts. And this underdevelopment isn't a natural phenomenon. It's got its roots in European colonialism, which entrenched an extractive economic system that expropriated wealth and resources from the colonies in the Global South to the European colonial powers in the Global North. So compare the world system map on the top of the slide here with the time series video of the geographic sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and you'll see a strong correlation. And one way we can interpret that is through world systems theory. So Immanuel Wallerstein, who's one of the core people of world systems theory, argues that the global economy can be thought of as one entity in which all countries are a part. And that entity can be divided into three primary regions. So first of all, you've got the core, which are the dominant states with the strongest economies and the most powerful militaries. And these core countries exploit the periphery for raw materials and labour and extract profits. So these are the imperial countries, the colonists. Then you've got the periphery, which consists of the least developed countries who are dependent on the core for capital investment and are the object of exploitation. So these are the colonies. Finally, you've got the semi-periphery, which have characteristics of both core and periphery countries. They're highly dependent on trade with the core, and often these are former colonies. Places like Australia that have become part of the developed world, but still maintain some of the structural characteristics of a colonial extractive economy. And one of the issues with this system is that this kind of extractive arrangement can't be established and it can't be maintained without a high level of violence. As critical IR scholars have demonstrated, the logics of colonialism remain embedded in every aspect of international relations. That logic is in the structure of the global economy and in the power relationships between states. That logic is in the drawing of state borders across the world based on conquest and cutting across existing nations in colonised lands. It's in the ideologies of white supremacy and Western exceptionalism that have shaped our political theories and institutions. It's even in the norm of state sovereignty itself, in the concept of written treaties, and in the modern state system more generally, all of which are artefacts of European politics, and that model was exported globally through colonisation and empire. And we also see this logic in environmental politics. We see it in how the global north countries interpret climate-related security threats and population displacements. Indeed, the fact that they see them as threat, that's part of this logic. And we see it in the extractive logic of how humans relate to the environment in mainstream development discourses. These maps here tell the story. These are ethno-linguistic maps of Australia and North and South America. And these are kind of rough proxies for what the political boundaries might have looked like pre-conquest in each of these continents. As you can see, they don't map neatly with today's national borders. So what had to happen in order for the borders illustrated here to transform into the state borders that we know today? Well, as a political system of rule and control, colonialism was violent and repressive. It was often based on the genocide and the dispossession of First Nations peoples. It undermined Indigenous cultural knowledge systems. It created hierarchies of new class structures, and it weakened traditional social bonds. People in the colonies were often forced to speak languages other than their own and to conform to legal and political norms that were foreign to them. It brought us our modern understanding of race, where colonised peoples were systematically discriminated against based on a constructed notion of racial inferiority. And we can't forget the brutal international slave trade, which forced millions of people around the world into bonded servitude. So no, this is not a pretty story. However, this is how the international system as we know it today was shaped. And many of the bitter divisions within the UNFCCC process and the debates about common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as issues related to vulnerability and adaptation, all of these disagreements have their roots in this story. And while we're in this space, I want to touch on the idea of ecological debt. So the extraction of raw materials and extraction of other products from the global south countries made the global north countries wealthy and powerful. So in effect, the industrialization of the global north was financed by colonialism. And indeed, extraction is the logic of colonialism, and it's the logic of empire as an economic system. So if we take a systems view, extraction is what it's about. Industrialization was made possible by the extraction of wealth and resources from the colonies, which in turn created the huge developmental imbalance that we recognize today as the developed and the developing worlds, or the global north and the global south. Which in turn, in climate politics, that's how the underpinning of why we see large differences today between the adaptive capacities and climate vulnerabilities of different states around the world. Developed countries have also made disproportionate use of environmental commons and the sovereign lands of the global south as pollution sinks without consent or payment. And this includes the dumping of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, as well as more localised pollution of land and water through mining and dirty industries. So there's a strong argument to be made that the UNFCCC can't fulfil its mandate unless these injustices are addressed. And that's the spirit behind the doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities that's in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Well, that's the big picture view of climate justice, but what does international climate justice look like from the ground up? So think back to our discussion of feminist IR theory in week 6. This is a key perspective through which climate justice can be interrogated. Different individuals and different groups relate differently to climate change due to their complex, cross-cutting relationships to different structures of power. And this is based on the concept of intersectionality, which helps us understand the impacts of multi-layered, unequal power relationships across class, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, where you live. A whole number of different axes come into play here. So in the context of climate change, intersectionality highlights the different axes of systemic disempowerment that create unique climate vulnerabilities and unique adaptation challenges for individuals and communities based on their specific circumstances. Indeed, it's this structural element that's important here. Intersectionality helps us to understand what the discriminations that people face tells us about the systems of power that exist within countries and that exist across the international system. So as political analysts, we can't ignore that every human interaction is mediated by different power relationships. So an intersectional analysis shows us how different axes of discrimination reinforce each other to disempower some people or increase the power of others, and more importantly, what the impacts of this look like. However, intersectionality as a tool of political analysis is not about framing a pissing contest over who's more discriminated against. Nor should it be dismissed as identity politics, which I find to be a condescending label used to dismiss people's lived experiences of discrimination. Nor is it a shaming device against those who benefit more from existing power structures. So I'll let you in on how I employ intersectionality. So as an academic, I find it to be a powerful analytical tool for understanding the power relationships that emerge from complex interdependence. But from a professional and an activist and personal perspective, putting this into practice is a little bit more. It's a bit like common but differentiated responsibilities at an interpersonal level. The needs and responsibilities that come from an intersectional understanding of climate justice will be different for everyone, depending on your unique circumstances and where you sit in the web of power relationships. Vulnerability to climate change is complex and it's contextual. So understanding who is vulnerable, why they're vulnerable, and what to do about it are key adaptation questions. And they're adaptation questions that are faced by all of us. As an epistemology, or a way of knowing, intersectionality looks to people's lived experiences as an important data source. And the best way to access this data source is to shut the fuck up and listen. And it's subversive to institutions that don't listen. So top-down governance from the state and from international institutions generally tells people on the ground how it is. An intersectional approach challenges that. It's grassroots, it's bottom-up. So you can see how complementary this approach is with best practice adaptation and resilience building that's based on local knowledge and decentralised decision-making, which we identified as best practice in week 6. Or to put this another way, nothing about us without us. So that's a phrase that comes from a number of different movements. For me, I'm familiar with it from the neurodiversity movement. But it means don't make policy that impacts people without their participation and consent. Environmental racism is one of the major climate justice issues. So climate vulnerability and adaptation is affected everywhere that there are pre-existing social cleavages that are based on race and ethnicity. Structural racism stems from systems of social structures that produce and reproduce cumulative, durable, race-based inequalities. And climate change interacts with structural racism to make both of them worse. Now, the white supremacy pyramid on the slide here gives you a clue as to what structural racism can look like. Now, this pyramid's been developed in a US context, but we could easily compile something similar for Australia and any other settler colonial country for that matter. But for our purposes here, I want you to think about the implications of superimposing significant climate change impacts on top of this kind of structure of racial discrimination. What might this mean for climate vulnerability and adaptive capacity, both of the people discriminated against and the broader society itself? As an illustrative example, let's reflect back on Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in the US back in 2005. Now, during this event, many residents were stranded in the city when the Category 5 Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, which highlights the problem of disaster immobility that we touched on last week. The people who were unable to evacuate were predominantly poor and predominantly people of colour, highlighting the racialised aspect of poverty in the United States. As we saw previously in our discussion on adaptation, financial resources and assets give people options in a crisis situation. So for these people that got stuck without access to a car, without enough disposable income to buy a plane, bus or train ticket out of the city, these people were left immobile and were left to fend for themselves during the storm and for several days afterward. We also saw police and vigilante violence against African American people who attempted to flee the city on foot. I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this case study, there's an amazing documentary directed by Spike Lee called When the Levees Broke, which you should be able to find somewhere on YouTube, but it documents all of this stuff in great detail. The environmental racism of place comes up in other ways as well. Across the world, people of colour and low-income communities are often exposed to negative outcomes stemming from environmental pollution, largely through the proximity of polluting industries to their homes, so places like factory precincts or mines or oil refineries. So this is where we see the intersection of ingrained economic disadvantage with racism. So just as a thought exercise, I encourage you to reflect on your own city or town, whether it's in Melbourne or in regional Victoria, or if you're further afield. Ask yourself, where are the highest polluting sites in your area and who lives near them? What are the socioeconomic and ethnic demographics of the people that live near these places? I'd be very surprised if they didn't fit the pattern that I'm describing here. In many countries, women are at the forefront of living with the reality of the injustices caused by climate change. The gendered impacts of disasters affect things like emergency response and reconstruction and recovery efforts, and they're also relevant to the prevention and mitigation of climate impact events. But men and women are clearly both affected by disasters, but social, cultural, and economic factors mean that they tend to be affected differently. So while both men and women are vulnerable in poverty, the prevalence of gender discrimination means that women tend to be more limited in the resources that they have to cope. And when we apply an intersectional lens, that risk is even greater for women of colour and women from poorer communities. Women and children are over 10 times more likely to die during natural disaster events and in their immediate aftermath. Women are also at a far greater risk of sexual assault in the aftermath of a disaster. It's a no-brainer that women's voices need to be heard in climate mitigation and adaptation discourses, and their priorities supported as part of a commitment to climate justice. Gender equality is embedded as one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see the 6 core objectives of the Gender Equality Sustainable Development Goal here. Each of these objectives intersects with environmental vulnerability and adaptive capacity in complex ways. The SDGs are intended to inform practice across the family of UN agencies and also to influence government policies of UN signatory states. However, like all elements of climate justice, meaningful action is being advanced through the grassroots actions of social movement actors rather than international institutions. Because institutions, governments and international alike, tend to be more reactive. Queer and trans communities also bring an important wisdom that's relevant to the building of adaptive capacity. And here I'd like to quote from queer and trans activists Aletta Brady, Anthony Torres and Philip Brown from the US. And I quote, "We also believe that the queer and trans communities bring something unique to the struggle and something essential. In response to societies that enforce binary gender roles, expression and identity, and violently target people who defy these rules, queer and trans people have learned to create our own communities rooted in love and care for each other and the environment around us. To survive, we've developed resilient and interdependent communities that challenge societal norms that condition us to be individualistic, materialistic, and competitive. Queer communities, excluded from mainstream society, have embraced interconnectedness, open communication, and collaboration." Unquote. And I think there's some really important wisdom there. When you look at this from an adaptation perspective, that's some good medicine. One of the inspiring new developments in global climate politics over the past few years has been the emergence of young people as a key voice in the global climate movement. Greta Thunberg has been the face of this movement generally, but it's a global movement that has many leaders across the world. You'll also hear climate activists ask what future generations will make of our responses to climate change. It's true that future generations will inherit a world that's radically different to what we experience now and what we've experienced over previous centuries. What kind of life choices will be available to our descendants as a result of our collective alteration of the global climate? As a parent, this is an animating question for me that sits heavily on my conscience. And the answer to that question depends on what we as a society and we as a world do now to address the carbon mitigation problem. There are calls to factor in future generations into the governance structures and decision-making of global climate politics. At an operational level, the former UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, who's here on the bottom right in the green coat, has argued for an intergenerational perspective in climate governance that evaluates decision-making through the eyes of future generations, guided by the concept of intergenerational equity. Future generations do require representation if their needs are to be given consideration in today's institutional decision-making. And this requires an approach to the relationship with the Earth that's based less on short-term exploitation and more on long-term custodianship. The climate justice movement also includes demands to provide political representation for the needs of non-human life. The dominant extractive worldview in our political economy tends to see animals and ecosystems as objects, as having only instrumental value. They're a means to human ends. They're resources and commodities or biological machines. But from a climate justice perspective, animals and ecosystems have intrinsic value, and as such, humans have a direct duty to be custodians and caretakers of the non-human world. This ecocentric perspective is reflected in some multilateral documents. For example, the World Charter of Nature came out of the UN General Assembly in 1982, and this was underpinned by strong ecocentric principles, stipulating that humanity and culture are part of nature. Later that decade, in the 1980s, the Earth Charter emerged from the Our Common Future conference in 1987. And you'll recall the Our Common Future report from that conference was the birth of sustainable development as a discourse. So the Earth Charter here was advanced through the UN system from Our Common Future at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. It ended up being formally released in 2000, and it's been largely driven through the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. It hasn't, however, managed to gain traction in the UN's primary environmental governance frameworks like the UNFCCC or the Rio Summit process. There's also the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which came out of the 2010 World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia. And I'll revisit this again in next week's video. There is a growing movement to embed ecocentrism into the International Criminal Court. In 2010, the late British lawyer Polly Higgins submitted a proposal to the International Law Commission to amend the Rome Statute to include an international crime of ecocide as the fifth international crime against peace. So remember, the Rome Statute is the same instrument that prohibits crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity. The inclusion of ecocide as international law would prohibit mass damage and destruction of the earth and create a legal duty of care to prevent, prohibit and preempt both human-caused ecocide and natural catastrophes. Remember the two-level game that we talked about in week 4. Social movements and people at the grassroots play an important role in the political ecosystem of global climate politics. But you've probably also noticed another theme in exploring international climate justice, and that's that international institutions and national governments are not very good at championing climate justice or addressing structural discriminations, and often they're part of the problem. This means that it's left to people and communities at the grassroots to shine a light on systemic discrimination and to do the hard work of keeping power accountable and of developing different models for governance and interaction. These are the themes that we're going to return to again over the remaining weeks of Pol 3 IPC.